Hey guys, welcome to my channel. This is the second video of a series of videos I'm going to make about how the universe learns to understand itself. It provides a framework to understand that by using information as the most fundamental aspect of the universe. And it's interesting to set up these videos in this series because the series in itself is how information organizes itself through perspectives so that the universe can form a better understanding of itself. So the way I'm doing this is the first video was just my perspective of how it organizes itself and learns more. And from now on, I'm going to add other people's perspectives so that no matter what walk of life you come from, you can find a perspective that resonates with you. So today I have Angela Bhattarai, who is a family therapist at the university in the town we're making this video in. And she's going to offer her perspective on most of the slides that we're going to go through. We made a list of points that we're going to make sure to talk about during this video, but we'll also be freely talking every now and then as well. So information is a good representation of existence at fundamental scales because it can hold the place of any pattern. This is also why integrated information theories are used in research in consciousness and quantum mechanics, which helps mold the two, meaning quantum mechanics and consciousness, together through synchronization, since synchronization can be found in quantum theory and consciousness research. So you can think of information at the most fundamental level being binary, 0 and 1, which is the simplest ways you can express information and why it's good to use. And then through different perspectives, through stereoscopic channels that create different perspectives, you can have disparity, which is differences in those perspectives, and that's going to create geometry, and that geometry represents the space-time, which is just a geometrical pattern that is how everything is woven together, which ultimately creates gravity, and that gravity is how matter and structure is all formed together to create things as big as the universe, but also to create things like life and consciousness. So we're going to get into how all of these different things work in detail, but first I turn it over to Angela.
Thank you, Dr. Grazer, for inviting me to your video. I'm excited to learn about universe and this presentation, the quantum mechanics, and how it's somewhat similar to how we work in family therapy system. To get into it with what you said so far, can you explain a little bit more about integrated information theory and what exactly is fundamental information?
So I would also like to note that it was Angela's request not to be part of the video. It is just a Saturday and we're just relaxed here. And she was a little bashful about being on to begin with, so you're just going to be seeing me while she talks into the mic. So to answer your question about what exactly fundamental information is and what it has to do with integrated information theory. So fundamental information can be represented by zeros and ones. However, zeros and ones is just a way for us to think about it. It could be representing energy is here or not here. It could be representing if matter is there or not there. It can be representing if a wave is there or not there. So this is just a placeholder for patterns to emerge from. So it can be representing anything, but what it's definitely representing is the patterns of fundamental information. So how that relates to consciousness and quantum mechanics is through integrated information theory, which is used in both quantum mechanics and consciousness research. And that's basically just showing you how information is integrated or organized in these systems, which we'll get more into how information is organized in these systems in the future slides. So first, let's talk about the two main theoretical frameworks that physics uses to describe how this information functions. So the great divide in physics, classical physics and quantum physics. So classical is a continuous cause and effect relationship that smooths over the discrete information found in quantum mechanics. Therefore, quantum mechanics is discrete. That just means it's broken down bit by bit and favors correlation over causation. Quantum helps to understand how information synchronizes, while classical helps understand the large-scale geometry that emerges due to this synchronization. So we'll get more into quantum versus classical in the future slide, and I'll mathematically explain how these work. But first, let's talk to Angela about a family perspective.
This reminds me of the difference between linear and circular causality in systemic family therapy. Um, the linear view assigns singular one-way path, which is like A causes B, whereas systemic reciprocal causality views event as continuous bidirectional feedback loops where every action influences the next. Like say, for example, A influences B and B influences A. So now let's take a look at simpler example in a family. Since linear causality stands for one thing causes another, let's say the example would be a child is late to school, so parents get angry. So this assume child is late as a cause and parents get angry as a result. In contrast to this, circular causality stands for each person's behavior affects the other in a loop. Let's take an example of child is late to the school, so the parents get angry. Parents get angry makes the child feel more upset, so the child resists getting ready the next day, and this makes parent even more angry. So these events keep influencing each other and help maintaining the problem. So these assume that child is late, parent gets angry, child reacts, parent gets angry again, and it's a constant feedback loop that maintains the problem.
So that's a good connection to family therapy. So thinking about it from a classical perspective and what runs into problems is thinking about things linearly as, oh, the kid's late for school, so the parents are mad at him and it's the kid's fault. However, that's not the best way to look at it since the family system and all of biology from a theoretical standpoint is being looked at as a quantum advanced complex adaptive system. So from a quantum standpoint, everything is acting in the form of circular causality, as Angela explained, so that the parents getting mad at the kid for being late for school will put more pressure on the kid and will cause them to be late for school a lot more often, and then the parents are just going to keep on getting mad. So understanding this as a complex adaptive system and how everything influences another will help you understand how the system is actually working and the real cause and effect relationships that are going on so you can better fix the problem. And that's where the more new age psychological approaches to mental health, I think, are pointing towards. And that's why we're having family systems theory come into the mental health landscape and why I thought it was important to bring Angela on to these perspectives in these videos. So now let's gain a better understanding of what exactly quantum physics and classical physics from a mathematical standpoint, what exactly or the how are those frameworks different? So let's talk about classical probability and quantum probability. So quantum probabilities interfere together like waves so that the probabilities synchronize together, while classical probability simply adds the probabilities together. And as we kind of discussed previously, family dynamics can be described as a complex adaptive system because the behavior of each family member synchronizes together. It cannot simply be explained by addition or linear ways of thinking. So if you want to explain this mathematically, you can think of classical probability as just if you have two different waves, you add the waves together. So that's wave one and wave two. And if you square it, you get the square of sums, which has all of the information available in wave one and two, you can also find in the square of sums. However, quantum probability doesn't exactly work like that because you have interference. So from a quantum standpoint, you take wave one and wave two, you square them both, and that gives you wave one and wave two squared. And then when you add those together, what you get is the sum of squares. So that's wave one and wave two squared, which integrates wave one and wave two together. So it's not just simply adding them together, it's synchronizing them so that wave one and wave two, the structure of them synchronizes together just like waves in the ocean interfering, where two high waves come together and create a larger wave. But if a low and a high wave come together, they'll cancel each other out. So in quantum probability, you have the wave interference pattern occurring. So you have integrated information so that the sum of squares does not equal the square of sums. So since that doesn't equal each other, that's where quantum mechanics is different from classical mechanics. So you can understand how the different probabilities works. One of them, the information interferes with each other at the fundamental level, and the other one, it's just simple addition.
Exciting. And yes, you are correct. Similar to the explanation of quantum mechanics, in systems theory, family system is considered greater than the sum of its parts. This concept, known in systems theory, is known as synergy or emergence, means the collective unit creates unique dynamics, strengths, and behaviors that do not exist when individuals operate in isolation. So a simple example of emergence or synergy in a family system, let's say a child is usually shy when alone. A parent is usually stressed when alone. But when they spend time together, the parent's calm support helps the child open up, and the child's openness helps parent relax. Hence, synergy of these events is creating a complex adaptive system within a family, and it only gets bigger and bigger as more information gets integrated.
So that's a very good real world example of how integration or interference patterns work even in a family system, because just like you have wave one and wave two integrated together creates something different than the sum of its parts, the a family integrated together will have different behaviors than the individuals in that family alone. As Angela described, some of them might be more shy whenever they're alone, but then when they're with their family, they're more open and more talkative. So that's a great example of how quantum probability creates emergent structure that can't be found in the individual parts, and that is similar to a family working the same way. So now let's take a deeper dive into how these emergent patterns form and an intuitive way to think about them, which will also help you think about quantum mechanics. So now let's consider stereoscopic channels and superimposed images of those two stereoscopic channels. So this can help you describe electron superposition, which behaves similarly to how two eyes create a superimposed image through stereoscopic channels. Changing one will change the superimposed image. So when you hear about quantum entanglement or quantum superposition, you can think of it as one electron is a left channel, the other electron is the right channel, and when those two electrons become entangled, they create a superimposed image that is the two images integrated or interfering or synchronizing with one another. So if you change one pixel or one bit of information or one unit of energy or mass in one particle, then that will change how both particles are correlated together. So it's not that information is traveling between them, it's just that their correlation changes. So the superimposed image changes. And this isn't just happening with electrons, it's also happening with your eyes. Your left and right eye create a superimposed image of what both eyes are seeing together. So that gives humans a very intuitive way to think about fundamental particle behavior. So I'll move it to Angela to continue.
This is very interesting. So, we perceive depth and stability of the image using two eyes. I think that's what I heard from what you just said. So, how do you explain this phenomena from perspective of a person who can only see with one eye? Because our viewers might be confused with the vision versus perspective formation. How can one eye still form depth for an image?
So Angela asked an important question. So I used the example of two human eyes and how they superimpose images seen in the left and right eye to create one image. However, even in one eye, you can still see depth. So how is that one eye creating depth? Two eyes kind of help create depth, but one eye can still see depth. So if this depth is being created by the disparity between left and right, how come even in one eye you can still see depth? And that's because even in one eye, you still have left and right differences. For instance, in the specific cells in your retina, and if you want to go deeper than that, even the rhodopsin receptor in in your optical nerve cells that incorporate the light as information. So you have a little tiny rhodopsin receptor on the retina of all of your eyes, on the surface of your eye, and you have probably millions of those receptors, which are all receiving a slightly different perspective of the light coming in. So even those receptors can have left and right, receptors close to each other can have left and right perspectives that can integrate the information coming in, which creates a disparity, which can be used to create depth. The same way your left and your right eye create depth, and even the same way two electrons can integrate information. So you have to remember that this is going on at all scales, from electrons to receptors to cells to eyes to whole organisms trying to combine their perspectives in a family. So this isn't just something that's happening with your eyes. This is a way that information can be organized through different perspectives through integration of that information. And you can think of that integration as waves combining together, just like in the ocean, so that some of those waves will get bigger and some will cancel out, so that information is integrated. It's not just simply added together. So I think that moves us on to our next slide, explaining how nature creates new realities. So this is just summing up what we talked about previously, that perspectives synchronized together creates new realities and mediate emergence at all scales. So you have the binary information. That binary information can be viewed through different perspectives. Those different perspectives have disparity when they relate to each other, and that will create different geometry, geometrical emergence with how those relations combine. And then that geometry is space-time, and then that space-time will create gravity, because all gravity is the curvature of space-time. And we'll go deeper in future slides how exactly, space and time come together to create reality and what that means for us and our conscious experience of time, but that's for later slides. But what this slide is trying to show is that reality is emergent, and it all emerges from how the fundamental information, the fundamental building blocks of reality group together and combined through different perspectives. So let's move to the next slide. So everything is connected and continuously synchronizing. Empty space is constantly fluctuating to enhance the connection of new perspectives. And this is known to exist through the Casimir effect and through the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So it's not that this information isn't finding new perspectives on its own, it's connected to all other perspectives in space and time. And as new perspectives emerge, those new perspectives are trying to combine with all past perspectives to create new connections, which create new geometry and potentiate the geometry that can form in the future. So we know quantum fluctuations occur through the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the Casimir effect. However, what those quantum fluctuations are, even in free space, it's hard to kind of think about them. But one way you can think about them is is the fundamental information of reality always fluctuating and trying to find new connections or new perspectives.
The quantum vacuum is not empty. This title, you perfectly describe the bedrock principle of systemic family therapy. In systemic family therapy, the phrase, you do not exist in isolation or vacuum, means that individual behaviors, symptoms, or struggles cannot be understood in isolation. Instead, every person is an interconnected part of a larger relational ecosystem where actions and reactions continuously shape and are shaped by the entire family dynamics. Here's an example of how we approach a family in dysfunction from this perspective. Rather than asking, what is wrong with this person? We ask, what is happening in the system that this behavior makes sense? Remember, going back to our previous slide where quantum probability talked about contextual. Every behavior makes sense in context. You look for relational information. Because no one exists in vacuum, systemic therapy offers distinct methods for understanding human behavior.
So everything isn't in a vacuum. It's actually in a fluctuating environmental system. So when you do something, you have to think that that's going to translate to everything around you in a family system, and that there's actually a mechanism to how all of this connects, not just for us as humans, but for all scales of organized information, as we talked about previously. So let's continue to quantum mechanics and how it uses waves. So even at the fundamental level of particles, nature behaves as waves to form relationships and to think together. So we went over this before, that at the fundamental level, whenever you have integration of information, you have wave integration, which isn't simply adding the information together, but the information interferes with each other to create a new perspective.
And this perfectly explains circular causality to explain phenomena and the interdependence of different events happening at the same time, too.
So continuing on to the next slide, we'll talk about how all of these informational channels come together to form existence in the universe by exploring all possible paths. So choices made through the synchronization of relationships determines the path reality takes. It could have happened very differently. So there's many different realities that could exist. However, we are just on a certain outcome because of choices that have been made in the past. Because maybe in the past, atoms could have formed slightly different in a slightly different way. However, since they formed how they did in the past, we are stuck being made of atoms. So even though you have all these different possibilities, they are constrained by what has happened in the past, so that I can still have free will and decide what's going to happen with the possibilities in hand. However, there are some things that have already been determined.
Uh, Systemic family therapy, describing universe as a network of possible paths, aligns perfectly with the concept of circular causality, equipotentiality, and the lens of possibilities. So rather than a rigid linear timeline, the family system is viewed as a interconnected ecology of interacting choices and ongoing relational dynamic. So what is equipotentiality? It's a concept that acknowledges the a single event, example, stressful life transition or parents' actions, that does not dictate a single destiny. Instead, it opens up a network of multiple possible outcomes, with the path chosen depending on how family interacts and responds. So we already discussed about the circular causality. That's another aspect of, in terms of talking of network of possible paths. Circular causality suggests that cause and effects are recursive rather than linear. One person's behavior doesn't just cause another's. Instead, family members influence each other in continuous feedback loops, meaning a system can alter its direction by stepping onto a new relational path. And at last, we're going to talk about the lens of possibilities. It particularly emphasizes in narrative and solution focused models. This mindset rejects the idea of a fixed problem and instead helps families explore alternative storylines, highlighting that there are always unexamined paths to resolutions.
So I think that's a good way to look at the family system as a network of possible paths, because that will help family members resolve problems, I believe, if they look at this through a systems way of thinking, because they will see more available paths to that resolution instead of looking at things linearly as we discussed previously. So that moves us to how all this information comes together to form new geometry through percolation theory. So new geometry percolates out of the combination or synchronization of perspectives. These perspectives combine in a similar fashion to bubbles percolating in a coffee pot or a forest fire gaining intensity. The universe is constantly connecting and becoming more complex. So percolation theory might sound complicated, but it's really just nodes of organized information that slowly come together, like a bunch of different bubbles coming together, or like a bunch of different fires in a forest eventually connecting so that eventually the whole system is connected and you have emergent geometry and new things emerging in the universe. So you can think of it as just the universe increasing in complexity and increasing geometrical patterns and ways for information to organize.
I like the example of coffee pot and forest fire. From a relationship perspective, percolation theory models how isolated possibilities like new behaviors, alternative perspectives, or interventions spread through interpersonal networks, shifting a family from dysfunctional rigid state into a healthy adaptive one. It seems the core mechanism of percolation include two different things. The first thing is the network, and next one is the threshold. So in network, the family system operates as interconnected network where individual members are nodes and their communication patterns are the links or bonds. The threshold, percolation theory dictates that the network is not changed by random isolated shift. Instead, change becomes a reality when enough connecting points shift to create a unified continuous path. In physics, this is also called percolation threshold.
Okay, so let's talk about that threshold just a little bit more too. So you can look right here in the order parameter part of the slide, and you have a critical point or a threshold that is crossed. And after that threshold is crossed, then all that information is clustered together a lot more quickly. But before that, you just have little pockets or nodes of information organizing until it gets to that critical threshold where everything organizes together very fast. So, one way you can think about this is how the human population learns about things. So this could be learning that washing your hands is good to do before you have surgery on somebody, or maybe that antibiotics are good to use whenever you have an infection. Whatever new innovation occurs in humanity, first it's little groups or little pockets of people who understand this, and as more and more people understand how this works, connections happen faster and faster until you're at the top right here where the whole world knows about it and you have a change in society. The same thing happens in families, the same thing happens in cells, the same thing happens in electrons. This is happening at all scales. This is just how information organizes itself. So that brings us to our next slide. So the long-range connection of these perspectives creates gravity from the pattern of connections in the network of possible paths. Gravity emerges from the network of information. So that's working at not only how everything is organized here on Earth, but how all the geometry in the whole universe is organized, from black holes to planets to stars to galaxy clusters. It's all just new information organizing to create different geometrical patterns that we observe in nature.
What really gives rise to gravity?
So then we can look at gravity as the structure of how all these perspectives are forming a network. So it's just the geometry. So gravity isn't really a fundamental force, it's just an emergent force due to how all these different informational perspectives are combining together. So that's why you'll see on YouTube and even in scientific articles that gravity isn't real and stuff like that. And it's what it's really talking about is gravity isn't a fundamental force, that it's an emergent force that emerges from how all how all this quantum information is connecting and creating new information.
This is very fascinating. There are so many concepts that overlaps in quantum physics or quantum way of looking at things, and systemic family therapy. Like, let's say in systemic family therapy, geometry refers to observable relationship structures like triangles, alliances, and hierarchical boundaries. Connectivity represents the invisible underlying emotional bonds, and communication flows just as physics posits that space time geometry emerges from quantum connectivity. Therapeutic geometry emerges organically from the relational interconnectedness of family members.
So that was a good explanation of all the different levels of connectivity. So now let's move on to talk about where all these possibilities of connection come from in the next slide. So the possibilities defined in Hilbert space, or our imagination from a human perspective, creates reality when entangled to other perspectives. We are a continuous evolution of these connections, and our imagination holds the possibilities.
Can you explain entanglement again?
So, entanglement in this slide is talking about how all of the possibilities, or again, from a human perspective, our imaginations can combine. So Hilbert space is talking about how electrons, all the possible ways electrons can combine through entanglement, which ends up creating geometry into existence, which emerges as quantum fields or gravitational fields. But from our perspectives, you can think of all these possibilities as our imagination, and when our imagination gets entangled with something we read from another human being, or a conversation we had from another human being, or maybe a movie we watched or something, when our imagination gets entangled with another imagination, then that can end up creating new geometry into existence, whether it be in the form of an innovation like washing your hands or using antimicrobial or antibiotics, or just something that can help yourself, some framework about yourself that can go on to help you understand the universe. So that moves us to our next slide about how connected the universe is. So we are connected to galaxies far, far away, which has been shown through gravitational waves at the LIGO Observatory in Livingston Parish, Louisiana. And I am making this video in Louisiana, so I had to give a shout out to LIGO since it is also in Louisiana. LIGO stands for Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, and it detects ripples in spacetime caused by the merging of two black holes, which can be many, many, many light years away. So this is just a good example of how everything is connected in the universe through these geometrical patterns, even black holes that are hundreds of light years away from us, and we have detected it with the LIGO detector.
This is very fascinating. So we exist in the same fabric of reality as everything else in the cosmos.
Yes, it is very interesting that we do exist in this fabric that's being created and represents space and time. So let's move on to ways that you can think about this fabric and its composition. So gravity can be thought of as a collective vibration of particles, similar to quasi-particles.
So this is a way that information organizes into wave patterns at bigger scales.
So yes, I'm describing gravity as a quasi-particle. However, quasi-particles are usually discussed in crystals or Bose-Einstein condensates, where you have many particles or many atoms oscillating or vibrating together. So in this instance, in in terms of gravitational waves, you can think of huge parts of the gravitational field vibrating together. So that's how it relates to a quasi-particle, because it's just a collective vibration. So it's just one way to think of how gravity connects everything. So gravity determines how information is organized, which creates a feedback loop to fundamental information.
So, this is how the universe evolves because new information gets integrated into the existing universe through a continuous feedback loop. This phenomena sounds similar to homeostasis concept is in family systems theory, where family constantly strives to be in equilibrium with the collective goals of the family.
Right. So the fundamental information of existence is emerging new information like humans and gravity, and that information will have an effect on the fundamental information. So the fundamental information, an example of that is the fundamental information is creating us, and we can have an effect on that fundamental information and how it is being organized. So now we'll move on to time and how this mechanism helps you understand Einstein's general theory of relativity. So the rate of geometrical change is what we experience as time. This is an intuitive way to think about Einstein's theory of general relativity. This is why GPS satellites must be calibrated to account for experiencing a faster rate of time compared to that on Earth. This has also been observed by the aging of astronauts. So whenever the closer you are to a gravitational field, the slower time will be moving. So the satellites that are orbiting Earth experience time a little bit faster. So in order to get our GPS coordinates to work correctly from those satellites, we have to account for that change in time so that our coordinates are correct. And this is not something new. This has been discovered and shown by Einstein's theory of general relativity almost 100 years ago. So when you hear of Einstein's theory of general relativity, it talks about how time is relative. And again, the way time is relative is the rate at which the geometry changes. So how fast does that information integrate with each other to form new geometry and emergent patterns and evolves, at which we experience as an evolution of geometry through time.
How does time work at different locations? Like, is it always same factors involved in determining if the time is going to be fast or slower than the Earth?
So that's why I talked about gravitational fields. So you can think about an intuitive way to think about it would be the more gravitational field you're in, the more that gravitational field is going to constrain the movement of that geometry. Therefore, time will be moving slower. That's why in movies like Interstellar, when the astronauts went into a black hole or got close to a black hole, they were experiencing so much gravity from that black hole that time moved a lot slower for them. So they aged a lot slower. And if they would go back to Earth, maybe hundreds upon thousands of years may have surpassed on Earth since time was moving slower for them close to a black hole. So the more gravity you have, the slower time is moving. And you can think about that as the gravity is constraining the geometry from integrating with itself to make new geometry. So it changes that geometry, and that change is what we experience as time. So now that brings us to our next slide. which shows that different places in the universe can evolve at different rates given this mechanism. Because time moves at different rates depending on location in the universe, evolution does not run at the same rate everywhere. So, at some places in the universe, maybe they have increased gravity on some certain planets, so that's going to change the rate that evolution occurs. Or some planets might have less gravity, which will also have an effect on the rate of new geometry forming and subsequently the rate of evolution. So let's move on to the next slide. I think we talked about time enough. Let's talk about life. So information emerges as life through biomolecular condensates via a mechanism called liquid-liquid phase separation, which follows the same rules of percolation and synchronization that we talked about previously. So liquid-liquid phase separation can be described as oil droplets in water. Oil is a liquid, just like water is a liquid. However, that oil can form little droplet structures in water, even though it's also a liquid. And that's how life got its start, through liquid-liquid phase separation. So certain DNA and RNA molecules and proteins. Some of them are more lipophilic or fat loving than others. So those fat loving DNA and RNA and proteins will aggregate with themselves in water, which will organize water around them in a different way through a process of liquid-liquid phase separation. So this is a way that these biological molecules can start to form boundary conditions before membranes were incorporated into the structure of life. And this is the basic way that information is organized in biological matter on Earth, and it follows percolation theory because you can think of the little water droplets of biological molecules aggregating together more and more and more and more until they form structures like cells that we are familiar with. So that not only follows percolation theory, but as the different droplets combine together, they synchronize the information in each droplet. So this is the key to how life organizes itself and forms adaptive pockets that can respond to the environment.
Exist at all scales.
Yes, I would say that percolation and synchronization exist at all scales. However, there are different perspectives that are being incorporated and integrated. So it is not exactly the same. I would say it rhymes. The synchronization creates an emergent framework that produces new information, but it rhymes because the same organizing principles are at play. So that brings us to our next slide about fractal organization. So the same pattern of information repeats at every scale, forming a fractal pattern of relationships that has the capacity to relate to itself through various perspectives.
So this allows us to understand things at scales that aren't revealed by our senses.
Yeah, so since the whole universe is organized through this information system, it allows us to have an imagination to things that are far outside of our senses. For instance, the liquid-liquid phase separation, the electrons combining and having a different perspective. Since it's the same informational framework at play, it allows our imagination to form in the same structure so we can have some sense or some awareness of how these different scales of existence work and are glued together. So that moves us to the next slide, which is about the U loop and the scaling of consciousness. So does the U stand for universe or does the U stand for us? So from particles, atoms, molecules, condensates, organelles like the mitochondria, cells, organisms like humans, and beyond, the universe is alive and learning as much as possible to create new possibilities. We may be to the universe what the mitochondria is to us.
How is our perspective similar to the mitochondria?
So that is a very counterintuitive way to look at it because everyone thinks that the mitochondria is just part of us. However, the mitochondria actually has its own DNA. And through endosymbiosis, the mitochondria used to be a bacteria that actually lives with us through a symbiotic relationship. So the mitochondria is actually a bacteria that has learned to live with us. So it has its own perspective on things. It just lives in its environment and tries to survive. It really has no ideas what our goals are. In the same sense, we are living similarly to a mitochondria. We live our life and we try to do the best for ourselves based on the environment, but we don't totally understand the environment we're embedded in. And the fact is that the environment we're embedded in might have information organizational skills similar to our consciousness, and it might have its own goals that we are not aware of. So that brings us to the closing. And this is all organized in a fractal perspective. So you can look at the smallest ones as electrons, and the electrons create molecules. Molecules can create biomolecular condensates and organelles like the mitochondria. That's going to come together to create organisms like humans. And then there's possibly even conscious systems working at bigger scales than humans. So that moves us to our closing, that we are how the universe learns, grows, and remembers using simple patterns with limitless implications.
So the universe learns and grows just as we do.
So that is the possibility, is that the way our consciousness works through information organization might be going on in the whole universe and beyond. So we can start thinking of things even beyond the observable universe. So that moves to the last slide, which I got this idea from a book called The Cosmic Code written by Heinz Pagels. And he used to love going on he was a physicist who loved going on adventures in the mountains, and he liked to climb mountains, and he was fearless in his pursuit. So I think his life through science and the hiking adventures he went on really shows us that we shouldn't be afraid to express our imagination, because it may be the perspective everyone needs to connect, synchronize, and percolate into the future, all connected together.
Yeah, this does gives us a very important lesson as well for life, that do not let fear limit your expression of your journey. Just be open to all the alternatives and possibilities, ideas as well, because that's where most of the time when you feel stuck, that's where you'll find solutions are embedded in.
So I think that's a good perspective to end on. I look forward to hearing everyone else's perspective. And please don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue to make perspectives like these. Have a good one.